All right, so we've gone through in 2 weeks. We've gone through the first 24 chapters of Genesis. If I wrote my notes down right on where we stopped last week, and so we've looked at everything. But I'm going to say this again, as I said before. If we can't believe Genesis, if we can't study Genesis and we can't believe what we read and what we see in Genesis, especially in the first probably 7 or 8 chapters of Genesis, if we can't believe that, then the rest of the Bible is really honestly not going to make a whole lot of sense to us. We have to believe that, and that's why Genesis is so important. And now as we get into, we looked at Abraham last week, and we really looked at him and the way God set him up and the way God called him out and his faithfulness to God. We saw a couple of things about him last week. We saw, one, that he was very faithful to God, but we also saw that he was prone to mistakes like we are. And so it helps us to understand that even the people God has called out, the ones that He called to be special for Him and to start the nation, had issues and had problems. And so that helps us in our own life. If we struggle sometimes, we just have to remember to go back to God. And we have to remember to return to Him. And so when we left last week, when we left in chapter 24, Abraham had sent his servant to get a bride for his son Isaac. He sent him back to the homeland, to his homeland, to receive a bride and to get a bride. And he sent his servant there with the instructions that God would lead him, that God would lead him. And when the servant got there, we saw that the servant immediately went to prayer, began praying that God would show him the right person that he had planned for Isaac. And the Lord answered that prayer, and Rebekah was there, and we see her coming into the story at this point. And so that brings us up to chapter 25. That brings us to chapter 25. And in 25, we see here at the beginning of this, we see that Abraham, in chapter 24, Abraham kind of thought, well, Sarah had passed away. He was getting older. He thought, well, that maybe his days were coming to an end. So he had Isaac, he had his servant go get a wife for Isaac, thinking that his days were coming to an end. And then we see here in chapter 25, as we begin to get in 25, we see that Abraham weds Keturah, so he weds again. We see that Isaac becomes Abraham's heir. We see that the Lord blesses Isaac in chapter 25. And then we see the death of Abraham there. We see the generations of Ishmael, and we see the generations of Isaac. And so chapter 25, at the beginning of that chapter, is very important to show us that the blessing, the covenant, is moving from Abraham to Isaac, just like God had promised that Isaac would be the chosen one. And we see that. But then we begin to see also here in 25, we begin to see the story of Isaac. Now in the Bible in Genesis, the story of Isaac isn't very long. There's not very much there. Most of this from this point on is going to be about Jacob until we get to the story of Joseph. But in chapter 25, after we see the death of Abraham, after we see the generations of Ishmael and we see the generations of Isaac, we see the story of Isaac and his wife, and we begin to see what happens here. And so the first thing in chapter 25, verse 21, we see this verse. And it says, "Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived." And so the important part of this chapter that I want us to look about and think about for a minute is not so much about all that's happened before this, but Isaac going to the Lord. So here he was the promised heir, he had been promised this, his wife was barren, she was not able to have children, and so instead of doing what his father did, now, we're going to see him make mistakes later, but instead of doing what his father did, he went before the Lord and he began to pray before the Lord for his wife. A couple of things to know about here. The importance of going before the Lord with our issues. He went before Him with his issues, and we need to understand that we need to go before the Lord and bring Him our troubles, bring Him our issues before we do anything else. The second is he was doing this for his family. He was pleading for his family. And we see that God answered prayers. We see that the birth birth of Esau and Jacob are here in chapter 25. And then we see the beginning of the trouble also. We see the beginning of the trouble with Esau and Jacob, these two twins that were born to Rebekah. We see the selling of the birthright there that really starts the downfall of everything. And then when you move to chapter 26, you will see God confirm the covenant with Isaac. You will see him confirm that covenant. You'll see Isaac go to Gerar, and there at Gerar, he will fall into the same trap that his father fell into. Verse 8 and 9 tells us, "Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, 'Quite obviously she is your wife, so how could you say she is my sister?' And Isaac said to him, 'Because I said, lest I die on account of her.'" So we see him falling into the same trap, the same issue that his father had fallen into whenever he said that she was his sister. And we see Isaac sin against God and sin against Abimelech, but we see God coming to Abimelech and helping him before anything happened. And so as we get into chapter 26, as we close out 26 and we see Isaac and the covenant with God, and we see the covenant that Isaac makes. As we go into 27, this is really where the story turns away from Isaac, and we begin to go into the story of Jacob, and the one that will eventually be called Israel. And so as we go into chapter 27 here, one of the things that's going to stand out in chapter 27 is we will begin to see how Jacob gets the blessing, or how Jacob gets the blessing of Isaac, and how he tricks him. But most of all, what we'll see here is we'll see how mom is favored one and dad is favored the other. And so as we look at this history here and we see this trickery, and as we see what is happening here and we see the scheming that's going about, it reminds us of how quickly we can fall into the trap of sin. How quickly our human nature is prone to scheme and prone to bring about what we think God should already do in our own life, and we try to make do in our own life. That as we go through here, we learn that Jacob is one that likes to scheme, and we see that Jacob is one that will do anything to get the blessing, even though God had already promised that he would be the one that would be blessed. We see Rebekah, the mother, helping. We see Esau going in and trying to get the blessing after his brother has already had it. We see Isaac here. We see Isaac wanting nothing from his older son other than the stew, the things of this world. And so as we begin to look at Jacob and Esau a little more, what we understand is the difference between the two. We'll begin to see that Esau is really truly a man of the world, and where Jacob, even though it appears right now he's a man of the world, we'll learn later on that Jacob is a man of God, and Jacob is one that will end up following God and being a completely different person than we see. It's important as we go through Genesis and we study the life of Jacob that we see how he started versus how he ended up, and the way that he slowly comes to God and the way that he really comes to know God throughout his life. It gives us help, and it gives us this sense of knowing that we too can know God, and we too can come to know him, and it's not a fast thing that happens, but we can. So at the end of chapter 27, we see Jacob running. We see him leaving because Esau was upset, and Esau was waiting, just waiting his time, basically. And so we see Jacob fleeing. And then we see in chapter 28, in verses 12 and 13, it says this: "Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven, and there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land of which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants." So as he is fleeing his brother and going back to the land from where his mother was from, we see him have a dream, a vision here. And this is the dream that he had. He saw this ladder up on the earth, and he saw the angels going up and down, and he saw the Lord at the top. But the important thing here is that the Lord made a covenant with him. He said, I will give this to you and your descendants. We should understand that this is where God began to really work in Jacob's life, and where Jacob really began to understand that God is in his life. And I think it's important for all of us to understand and know as we look at this too, that God is ever present in our life. God is ever present. He is always here. He is always near us. He is always around. We can always know that God's presence is near. We always pray, or you hear us pray, that God, that your presence would be close to us. God, that will feel your presence, or God, that will know that your presence are here. Or let God be with us and help us. What we must understand is that God is always here. God's presence is always around us. Jacob didn't understand that until this dream, and he understood that God's presence was always there. You and I must understand that God's presence is with us. We have to be willing and open to accept His presence and to reach out and find Him around us. He is always there to help us, but it's our heart that must feel out God and must feel for God and reach out for Him. And so we see Jacob have this dream and understand that God's presence is always there. And then we move on to chapter 29. And as we get into chapter 29, we begin to see Jacob have trouble with his family. So Jacob comes, he meets his uncle Laban, and they begin to barter and make bargains with each other, and they begin to see what they can do. And then we see Jacob fall in love with Rachel. And we see the story of Jacob wanting to marry Rachel, and he thought he had, and then he was tricked and he married Leah instead. And so he began to work another 7 years. He'd already worked 7 years for one. He begins to work another 7 years, and he marries Rachel as well. And we see the trouble begin between the two there, and we see the conflict in the family. We see that because of all that Jacob is doing, all the bargaining and everything that is happening with him, we see him here having issues. We see him turning his eyes away from God, honestly. And because of this, we see him having issues. But what we do see in verse 31 as we get to the bottom of chapter 29, in verse 31 we see this statement. When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, He opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. What we see here is we see God looking down upon His people. We see God looking down upon those that He loves. And He saw that Jacob did not love Leah. He saw that Jacob was not in love with her and that he was neglecting her. And so it said that she was able to have children where Rachel was not the one that Jacob truly loved. And so we begin to see the children of Israel being born here through Leah at first. And we begin to see this contest, so to say. I hate to use that word, but that's what it was a contest between Rachel and Leah. And we see this causing strife in their family. What we'll learn later on as we go through this is we'll see that Rachel and Leah both, we'll see that neither one of them were true followers of God at this time. You have to understand the issue with the family idols and the things that happened later. And we have to understand where they were at in their relationship with God. And at this time, there wasn't a good relationship with God. It shows us that in our own lives, if we don't have a good relationship with God, the trouble that can come about because we try to solve our problems on our own. Which leads us to chapter 30. In chapter 30, Rachel's crisis of not having children leads her to do what Abraham and Sarah did, and she begins to give her servants to Jacob. And we see Jacob have children with the servants, so Leah does the same thing, and now all of a sudden there's 4 wives. There's 4 wives in Jacob's life. And we begin to see the trouble happening and the jealousy that happens there. But we also see good news for Jacob. We understand that God continues to bless him even though he is far away from God at this point. We see God blessing him. We see his prosperity there. In verse 27 of chapter 30 it tells us this. And Laban said to him, "Please stay, if I have found favor in your eyes, for I have learned by experience that the Lord has blessed me for your sake." Even Laban here knew that the Lord was blessing Jacob, and because Jacob was there and married to his children, even Laban was getting the blessing. So Jacob agreed to stay again in chapter 30. We see him stay, and we see him continue to work, but we see him scheming and striving to continue to try to get away from Laban. All this time in the background, kind of in the background, you may not want to call it that way, but in the background, we see Rachel and Leah, we see their arguments, their fighting, all the things going on with them, a house that is in an unrest because Jacob is not leading them to the Lord the way he should. And then we go into chapter 31. As we get into chapter 31, we see Jacob begin to have more prosperity. We see him begin to have more success there because of the Lord blessing him. He becomes afraid of his uncle. He's afraid his uncle is going to come in and take things away from him. And so he leaves really quick. He leaves his uncle, he grabs his family, he runs away from his uncle really fast. And as he does that, in this, you'll see that Rachel stole the family idols, the gods that the family worshipped. That lets us know that Laban and his family were not worshiping God, the one true God. And so we see this, and we see Laban follow him, and we see him catch him, and he said, "Why did you run?" In verse 31 of chapter 31, it says, "Then Jacob answered and said to Laban, Because I was afraid, for I said, Perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force." So he was afraid. Once again, not trusting in God, not trusting in what God wanted him to do. And we see the trouble that it comes when we begin to not trust God. And this won't be the last time that he doesn't trust God. And then we'll go through to chapter 32. And in chapter 32, we see him heading home. So he's going back home. It's been a long time since he's been back home. And he's preparing to meet his brother Esau. And he's worried. He's scared. He sends all these people ahead of him. And he tries to give him gifts. And he does all these things for Esau. And his men come and tell him that a large group of men have left with Esau. And he gets scared. So he sends everybody away from the camp to the other side of the river there. And he stays. And as he stays that night, verse 9 through 12 tells us this in chapter 32. It says, "Then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, the Lord who said to me, Return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. For I fear him, lest he come and attack me, and the mother with the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." So we see him going before the Lord in prayer, and such a good prayer here, asking for safety, asking for his presence to be there to deliver him from the hand of his brother. He was afraid of his brother, so he was going to God for comfort. We see also in this chapter, not only does he go to God for comfort, but we see him still wrestling and struggling with his worldly delights and the things of this world. And so we see him literally wrestle against the angel and wrestle against God. And during that time, God changes his name from Jacob to Israel, that will be the father of Israel, the father of the country that God is going to establish. And we see him come away with a limp to remind him of this wrestling match that he has had. But to be alone with Christ, he came to know the knowledge of what God wanted to do. And as he wrestled with him, and he understood that he couldn't do anything. He was asking for a blessing. And finally, he received the blessing from God. And then in 33, we see him meeting his brother for the first time in a long time. And it's not the meeting he thought it would be. He was afraid. He was scared as he went into this meeting. But his brother came, and his brother was proud to see him, and his brother was excited to see him. In verse 5 it says, "And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children and said, Who are these with you? So he said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant." That was what Jacob said to Esau. See how much Jacob has grown just by meeting God in chapter 32. He gives God all the credit for everything. He gives God credit for his children in whom they were given to him. And then we see chapter 34 coming. We see that Jacob was supposed to go to one place, and Jacob went to a different place instead. And because of that, we see great trouble come. His daughter, Dinah, got in trouble, was raped. And when they came in verse 30, listen to what it says. "Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, You have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me. I shall be destroyed in my household and I." What you see here is the aftermath of what his sons Simeon and Levi had done. After their sister was raped, they see them going and making a deal with the town that if every man in the town would be circumcised, that they would let them marry their daughters. And after they were circumcised, Simeon and Levi went in and destroyed and killed every person in the town, taking retribution for themselves. All of this really happens for a couple of reasons. One, Jacob wasn't doing what God called him to do. He was at the wrong place. He wasn't where God wanted him. Two, he turned his back on God and trusted in the world instead of in God to protect him. And you can see here that he was afraid and that he would be destroyed because of what his sons had done, and he had not went to God and asked God for help. And then we go to 35, and in 35 we really see a change. And this is where I want to spend a little time tonight. Verse 2. Look at Genesis 35, verse 2. It says, "And Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, Put away the foreign gods that are among you. Purify yourselves, change your garments. Then let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way which I have gone." So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. So we see God come to Jacob, and God said, "I've had enough. I've had enough of your foreign gods. I've had enough of your idol worshiping. You are to put all that, you and everybody in your household are to put all those things away. Purify yourself, cleanse yourself, change your garments, be different now because you're new in me. Go and make an altar, go and worship me." And Jacob did that. And so Jacob finally went, and his family was purified. They came before God. There comes a time in our life, you and me, when we have to make that decision. We have to decide, I am no longer going to follow the world, but I am going to follow God. I'm going to put away all the foreign gods, all the idols that are in my life. I'm going to purify myself before the Lord, and I'm going to come clean before Him. So he went to Bethel, he made an altar, and he did that. And verse 4 tells us they all complied. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods which were in their hands and the earrings which were in their ears. And Jacob hid them under the tree. We see the people, when Jacob took leadership as the spiritual leader of his family and of the people that were under him, he changed their lives and he began to lead them toward the one true God. And that is what you and I must learn to do, is we must learn to give our life over to God. And as we give our life over to God, we must be willing to lead others that are under us and around us to the Lord as well. And so we see in this chapter him coming to the Lord the way that he should, putting all the idols away and coming into the presence of God. And that's what you and I must do. A lot of times we don't understand, or we may not think we have these idols in our life. His family and his friends are the servants and the ones under him. They probably had these idols and didn't even think about worshiping God a lot of times. But here was Jacob finally coming about and finally telling them what to do and how to handle it and to get rid of the gods, come before the Lord, and purify ourselves. Which brings us to chapter 36. The last chapter we covered before we had to stop for our pandemic was chapter 36. And this is the generation of Esau, and we see really the worldly side of Esau here. We see him going in, and we see him conquering, and we see him setting up this his nation. We see Edom set up, and we'll see Edom again later as you go through Joshua and you go through the book of them coming back into the promised land. But we see Esau really being a person of the world compared to Jacob, who is now a person of God, one who in the previous chapter went and placed his idols and put his idols away and came to know the Lord. And so as we catch up on the book of Genesis now, as we're getting close as we're back to where we started, we're going to start looking at Joseph now. But this catch-up really gets us back to where we're at. We see God's people sin. We see God's people forgiven, come back to Him. We see Him forgiving them. We see God blessing those that He has chosen and called out. We see Him blessing them even though they go against Him at times. We see His presence is always there. But we see that when they are willing to come back to Him, He is there to forgive. And now we're going to start looking at Joseph. And so this is going to be a little different. When I originally was going to do the study in Joseph, and we were really originally planning on doing this, we were going to be inside. I was going to be able to ask you questions, have you answer out loud, have things on the screen behind us. And so now we're going to have people in the parking lot. We're going to be inside. We're going to have people watching on Facebook on this. So we're going to have to do this a little different. And so as we go through this, if you want, I'm going to be asking questions still. I'll be answering them for you instead of having you answer them. But I'll be asking you questions. We'll be doing this like a study more than a sermon. So you may want to be prepared to have something to take a few notes down on if you want as we look at Joseph. But one thing that I challenge you to do is this. As you come and we begin to study Joseph, and we're really going to study the life of Joseph. We're going to really look at his life. We're going to look at some things that maybe you haven't seen before. But one thing you're going to have to know about this is you're probably going to have to unlearn some of the things that you've learned about Joseph. As we look at the life of Joseph, many times as we go through our Sunday school classes and we look at what is taught a lot of times and we see these cute stories of Joseph a lot of times, well, that's not going to be the way we're going to approach the life and the study of Joseph. We're going to look at Joseph as the person he truly is, as the person that God created, as the way that God moved him and the way that he was treated. But we're also going to see the sins that Joseph had. Joseph wasn't a perfect person. We're going to see the troubles that Joseph had in his life that he brought about sometimes on his own. And so we're going to paint Joseph in a light that all of us can understand as we begin to study. So next week we'll begin chapter 37. We will not be going through the entire chapter next week. So we'll go through a few verses. We will not make it all the way through that chapter, but we'll begin to study the life of Joseph and really get to know him, and then we'll wrap up the book of Genesis. So in 3 weeks we've covered 36 chapters of Genesis. It's been a whirlwind, but we've been able to just kind of review what we had already gone over in those weeks. So I encourage you to go ahead and start reading chapter 37, read about Joseph, go ahead and start reading that and looking at that, and then come in prepared to learn a little bit more about him next week.